Welcome, everyone, to this week's episode. We really appreciate you joining us. This podcast is intended to help us learn, live, and thrive in our own personal context. By sharing knowledge through our conversations, we will impart some knowledge while learning ourselves how to progress even further. I'm your host, Dawn Jones. You can participate in this conversation with me by sending a voicemail through dawnjonespeaks.com and commenting on the episode after the show. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe. Let's have a conversation. If you never had a reason to improve the way you communicate in your relationships, I'm about to give you one: your health. Dr. Redford Williams and Virginia Williams wrote a book called Life Skills: 8 Simple Ways to Build Stronger Relationships, Communicate More Clearly, and Improve Your Health. And they did a study, and here is a quote that they wrote in this book. One reason to build better relationships with our fellow humans is that by doing so, we lay the foundation for a life both happier and healthier. And they go on to list their key points. However, the point I want to highlight for our purpose is this, and I quote: social isolation, hostility, depression, and high-strain jobs all increase the risk of disease and death, especially when several of these factors are present at once. As often happens in low socioeconomic groups. A special interest here is that all of these problems intimately affect and are affected by relationships. End quote. In order for relationships to work, there must be communication, preferably good communication. So how does communication happen between two people? I know this question sounds elementary, but hear me out. The intent of communication is to convey an idea, emotion, directive, or feeling to the receiver. Communication can be verbal and nonverbal. And every communication has an express meaning that is transmitted to the receiver. Messages are received and interpreted through one or more of our 5 senses. And so when verbal and nonverbal cues in a relationship are received and interpreted as the sender intends, and one or more of the communicators are skillful with dialogue, a civil conversation can take place. And as you and I already know, our intended meaning does not always get transmitted effectively and or is interpreted by the receiver correctly, and conflict ensues. So constant conflict, no doubt, is stressful. The inability to communicate effectively over time has ended many a relationship.
Do you have a message that the rest of the world should hear? Become a podcaster. Anchor is the easiest way to make a podcast. Anchor gives you everything you need in one place for free, which you can use right from your smartphone or computer. Anchor's creation tools allow you to record and edit your podcast before publication, and they will even distribute your podcast for you. Get your message heard on popular media outlets such as Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and many more. You can even make money, and there's no minimum listenership to qualify. Get started today by downloading the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
I think that we would all agree that there's inherent value in relationships. People need people. We were created that way. Yet most people don't think to improve upon their communication skills or even make that a priority, even if a majority of their relationships are bad. Now, for the purposes of our conversation today, when I say relationships, I'm talking about family relationships, spousal relationships, and business relationships. So I'm not narrowing the focus. I want to leave it a little bit broad. So because we have room for recovery in all of our relationships. And so in these settings, communication takes on many forms. It could be verbal, it comes through our body language, and it's written, and so on and so forth. And we communicate our feelings and emotions through all of these particular mediums. And how we communicate through these various ways can either be an asset in our relationships or a liability. If we value our relationships, we have to then pay attention to what and how we are communicating to those on the receiving end. I want to give you a synopsis from Aesop's fable. And this particular fable is called The Boy Who Cried Wolf. You've probably heard it before, but I want to actually run through the story again just for a refresher. And so in this story, there was a shepherd boy who got bored watching the village sheep. And to combat the boredom, he had a bright idea to shout at the top of his lungs, "Wolf, wolf." And the wolf, he says, the wolf is chasing the sheep. And so all of the villagers come running to help him. But when they arrived, they found that there was no wolf. And so later on, the boy decided that it was a good idea to cry wolf, wolf again. And again, the villagers came running and found no wolf. And they tell the boy this time to only cry wolf when there's actually real danger to the sheep. But the boy didn't take them seriously and kind of gave them a smirk. And as you can guess, later on, the boy saw a real wolf prowling around the sheep, and he again screams, "Wolf, wolf." This time, no one comes because they think he's still playing a prank on them. And as the day progresses, the villagers begin to wonder why the boy had not returned with the sheep. When they find him, they discover that there really had been a wolf that scattered the sheep, and the boy wondered why no one came. One of the villagers said, "No one believes a liar, even when he is telling the truth." So in this story, the boy had been communicating to the villagers that he was a prankster and that he was willing to inconvenience others for his own pleasure. He didn't take value in the villagers over his own need to be entertained. And as a result, the boy's lack of respect and value for communication and relationship, when danger presented itself, communication had already broken down and the relationship was already frayed to the point the villagers didn't listen nor take him seriously. Wow. How many times have we experienced communication failures in one way or another and have not examined what and how we've been communicating? The only way we can sometimes know how we are perceived is to simply ask. Companies will do surveys because they know something about the art of communication. We've probably all worked at a place where the company thought that everything was going hunky-dory, and many of the workers can be on the verge of quitting. The point is, how we perceive ourselves is not always the way that others perceive us. People's perception becomes their reality. Later on, we're going to do a deeper dive into the aspects of communication, so I'll elaborate on that then. For now, let's just think about what value we are adding to our relationships through communications in its many forms. What could be improved upon? I saw the need for this in my own life a while back, and I jumped on an assertiveness training class when it was offered. I had trouble saying no to people. As a result of not being comfortable with saying no, I ended up being in a lot of places and involved in a lot of things that I really didn't want to be involved in. When I did say no, I had to back it up with all of these explanations and excuses. Long story short, it made me miserable while others thought of me as a pushover because that is what I was communicating. So how do we begin to repair or fix or improve upon our communication and our relationships? There are at least 7 skills that we can develop in order to improve in these areas. And I said earlier that we communicate through our 5 senses, so I'll start with actually a couple of those. The first one I think is huge in this day and age, and that's eye contact. Are we communicating through our eye contact that we're distracted, or are we communicating that we are actually engaged in the conversation? The reason why I say this is huge, because with the cell phone, a lot of us are in the room with people and everybody is looking down at their cell phones and not making eye contact. And I haven't seen the latest in research on how that actually plays out in our relationship. So but it's one thing to consider, is that our eye contact, with the lack of it or whatnot, it plays a role in what we are communicating. It tells people whether or not we're distracted, whether we're focusing in on what they're saying. It just communicates a lot. And so even though, as I said before, we have more communication going on, it doesn't necessarily mean that this more communication equals effective communication in all instances. The next thing to consider is body language. Is our body language telling people that we're open to conversation or that we're closed to conversation? One thing that I had a really bad habit of, I'm an overthinker sometimes, and I am usually in deep thought. And so when I'm in deep thought, I'm going places and I'm, just focused on what I'm trying to do. A lot of people will stop me and they'll say, "Stop looking so mean." Well, I'm not even aware that I'm looking mean. I'm just in thought mode and trying to get where I'm going to do what I need to do. But my facial expression was that maybe I was in an angry mood or in a bad mood. I also have a tendency to cross my arms when I'm thinking about what people are saying, and to other people that communicates that I'm closed off to what they're saying when I'm actually really in deep thought about what they're saying. The next thing is actively listening. Now, this is a skill. And you have to practice it in order to get good at it. And what active listening is that you're listening to the sender of the message without judgment, and you're not trying to think about what your comeback is going to be. You just listen and take in the information. This is not easy because for most of us, we're thinking about what we're going to say next. We're processing what they're saying and we're thinking of a comeback as soon as they get finished. And so we have to practice this skill if we want to be good at it. The fourth thing is the use of names and appropriate language. If you have trouble remembering names, then it's a good idea to repeat the person's name back to them. I happen to struggle in this area with the remembering of names, and so I have to make a conscious effort when someone introduces themselves to say, not just say hello, maybe say, "Hello, Nancy. Nice to meet you," and repeat their name back to them to try to make sure that A, I pronounce the name right, and B, I remember the name. And in doing so, also using appropriate language when we're talking to people. That is something that is, to me, is really coming up a lot lately, because now it used to be socially unacceptable to use curse words in everyday language, now it seems like it's becoming more socially acceptable in some circles to use foul language in general conversation. And so I'm not sure where each of you land on that, but knowing who you're talking to and how to talk to them appropriately is huge in communication. Some people can be turned off by the use of foul language in general conversation. And this shows up also not even in just personal conversations, but also in business relationships. People use inappropriate language, and some people are offended by that. On a personal note, in a personal setting, some people have grown up and individuals have never called them by their first name. It's always been a nickname or even a foul name to address the individual. And so if we want to improve upon our relationships, we have to know and discover what name people like to be called, what they actually go by, and how to appropriately address the individuals in our lives that we care about. The fifth thing is asking questions. Asking probing questions, asking different types of questions. So, and the purpose of this is to better understand what the individual is trying to communicate. Sometimes we make assumptions or we have an idea of what they mean. And then usually when communication breaks down, it's because someone made a statement, the receiver did not fully understand, and then they come back with an accusation. And so to help combat some of that, it's good to learn to ask questions or to restate what you thought you heard. So if somebody communicates something to you and you're not quite sure, rather than coming back with an accusation, say, let me see if I understood you. Let me repeat that back to you and make sure that I'm understanding what you are saying, and then repeat back what you thought you've heard. And then that gives the sender the opportunity to say, no, I didn't mean it like that. Or, yeah, that's exactly what I said. So you're giving them the opportunity. And so it's learning to ask appropriate questions and to restate what you thought you heard so that communication does not break down. The sixth thing is honesty, being honest. As I gave in my example earlier about the need for assertiveness training, because I was uncomfortable with saying no. And when I said yes, I was really not being honest. I was not being honest with myself, and I was not being honest with the other individuals. And so honesty plays a huge part in communication and in relationships. And we also saw that in Aesop's fable. 7, addressing issues early is huge in the maintenance of communication and relationships. And if we can address things assertively and not being passive aggressive, it's better. And those are learned skills. Those are definitely learned skills. When we don't address issues early, we allow them to fester, and then resentment builds, and then we have this big, huge blow up. Communication has broken all the way down, conflict ensues, and those situations are not pretty. So all of these breakdowns in communication contribute to stress. And going back to the introduction, it feeds into our mental health, our emotional health, and eventually our physical health when we don't have good communications and good relationships. So, what has resonated with you today? Are there new communication milestones that you would like to set in your relationships? It's not too late to get started improving in this area if you feel that you need to. And if you already have great communication skills, we would love to hear from you. Leave us a voicemail and contribute to the conversation. Share your story. Tell us how you learned to be a great communicator at DawnJonesSpeaks.com. Well, that's all for today's episode of Dawn Jones Speaks. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to download and subscribe. Also, if you want to join in on this week's conversation, head on over to DawnJonesSpeaks.com, where you can leave us a voicemail, find links to our social media, listen to past episodes, and sign up for our newsletter. Talk with you next week.